For our next session, we have Ms. Karthika VK from Westland Books. Karthika is a publisher at Westland Publications, now part of Pratilipi. She joined publishing in 1996 as an editorial assistant at Penguin Books India and moved to HarperCollins India as a publisher in 2006. She has published several award-winning and commercially successful writers including Arvind Adiga, Amrita Patil, Anuja Chauhan, Josie Joseph, Manu Joseph, Rana Das Gupta, Raghu Karnad, Rohini Mohan, Sarnath Banerjee, and Vishwajyoti Ghosh. At Westland, she led the launch of a new imprint called Context that publishes literary fiction and political non-fiction. Since its launch in February 2018, Context has published books by Amrita Mahale, Anita Nair, Aparna Jain, Apupin, Arundhati Subramaniam, Devapriya Roy, Kapil Komireddy, Karthika Nair, Manu Pillai, Paul Zakaria, Perumal Murugan, and Priya Kurian, among others. She is, as we all know, an alumnus of the Department of English, the University of Hyderabad. May I now invite Ms. Karthika VK to please talk to all of us.
Thank you. It's a bit unnerving actually being back in this university at a very different time from when we were here. And we actually didn't have all these things happening in the university either. Like we had very few people coming in from outside, doing talks. We were so self-absorbed and making the most of being free of home that it was a very different time to be in university, I think. But it's great to be here. Thank you, Pramod. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Meenakshi, for all the work getting us here. It's the reason I asked Urvashi to start the conversation, though, I mean, I kind of steamrolled into this because she did say no yesterday when I asked her. Then today, again, I got into it and said, no, please do it, please do it. But, I mean, she has done the pioneering work that brought someone like me into publishing. And so when Urvashi sets the context, she sets the context in a much bigger, much more historical way than I could have done. Also because there's a major conversation that has to happen and continues to happen all the time in India, in Indian writing in English and publishing, which is the independent and the multinational. I mean, this is what, in a sense, decides what goes where in terms of presence for readers, in terms of what is made available, what is published, all of that. And it's a very difficult space because the money, the clout, the years of backlist building that multinationals have done somewhere else, not in India, but somewhere else, comes in here and becomes the list that all of you will see and read and study. And Indian publishers who work with their own resources, their own money, their own markets have always struggled to go into that space of big volume, big sales numbers, big marketing. And that's the great pity of it, actually, because it should be the reverse, shouldn't it? I mean, it should be that the books that are made here, for readers here, within our own worlds, should be the thing that everybody wants to read and is engaged with. And the rest, yes, of course, there should be books from all over the world, but that all over the world that we talk about is also a small world. It is the UK and the US, really. You're not actually reading translations from Portugal and, well, you're reading some maybe of Spanish, maybe you're reading some books that come in from some particular languages, but why those come in here is also because the West has, in some senses, made a success of it. If Japanese murder mysteries are what you are looking at now as the new thing for everyone to read, that's because the UK made a success of Japanese writers being published in that. So it's somewhere one feels a bit helpless. One feels out of control here because you're not setting the terms of engagement. You are not giving readers here what maybe they want to read, but they are reading what is made available to them. So this thing we had yesterday morning at this, 10 o'clock in the morning, we were both standing there, she told you, at the W.H. Smith in the airport at the Terminal 2 in Delhi. And there's one shelf, like maybe this size, And they have these numbers which you may have seen, 1, 2, 3, 4, large numbers, books sitting there. And I was telling Urvashi, this is so deceptive, because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, according to whom? There is no science behind this bestseller sort of chart, right? It's not as though W.H. Smith said, we have a list and these are the books that sell the most, and therefore we are keeping them in this order. Maybe they have some sort of list and, roughly that's where they belong. But you walk into a store, you see these numbers, you pick up a book at the airport, you're reading, you're browsing, you're saying, maybe I want to read it. You turn to look at the chocolates and you put them somewhere. You may put them from number 5 to number 1. The guy in the store has no clue whether it is 1 or 5 or 6. It doesn't matter to them. The book will remain there. The next person will walk in and say, oh, this is the number 1 book for like everyone's reading. It's a self-fulfilling trip then. It becomes number 1 for a while, right? And everybody's thinking, oh, this is a really good book, must be, because it's number 1. But what is actually happening is those publishers have bought space. They have paid money to W.H. Smith for their presence on that shelf. Which is why the only publishers on those shelves are the big multinationals. So you'll have Penguin, you'll have HarperCollins, you will have Hachette, you would have some Rupa, maybe, a little bit, not really. Who else did we see? Simon & Schuster and Bloomsbury, and maybe PanMac at the most. These are the people who have large multinationals who have presence in India. Many of those books have been published in India, are written by Indian writers, and are clearly bestsellers anyway. You have the Chetan Bhagat, you have the Amish, etc. You have this new wave of bestsellers, which are which have to do with the larger reality of where India is going politically, and therefore what people are wanting to read. So you have books on, the new politics, which is Hindutva and Hindu heroes of nationalism, etc. So you have some segment like that. And then you have like a Colin Hoover. Who's read Colin Hoover here? Has anyone at all? No? Okay. Oh, you're not going to admit to reading Colin Hoover if you have. Right. That's all right too. But Colin Hoover was the only, I think, woman writer on those shelves. She's published by Hachette. And these are these huge best-selling romances. Nobody had heard of Colin Hoover in India. I think you hadn't yesterday when we went to the store. You were like, who's Colin Hoover, right? Yeah, she's not an important figure. I have not read her yet. I only know about her, and I've been meaning to read her, but I haven't gotten around to it. But she's huge. She's like the 1 million copies are selling in multiple languages around the world. And because of that, suddenly she's a bestseller in India as well. I rarely meet people. I ask people a lot, have you read Colin Hoover? Have you heard of Colin Hoover? Because I really want to know how, why, what. And no, most people I know haven't read her at all. But it's like 50 Shades of Grey. 50 Shades of Grey came out of nowhere, and then people just picked up on it, and then people loved it and they read it. Colin Hoover is in that category of, now we found her, we want more and more and more of her. And I think there are adaptations happening on screen and all of that is happening. So the point I'm trying to make is that bestseller that exists on a shelf is either sometimes not even a bestseller, sometimes has become a bestseller because it is the market forces, not readers, who have pushed it to bestseller status. And the other very easy way in the end is if it has been shown to be a bestseller or spoken of as a bestseller and hyped up as a bestseller, it eventually ends up becoming a bestseller. And we're all complicit in that as publishers, as people who support publishing in any way, whether as a distributor or a retailer. We all end up wanting that bestseller chart to work so much that eventually all the money also goes into that. So like a big publishing house will have a large list of, say, they're publishing 300 books in the year. But marketing money, which will be commensurate with this kind of ability to sell, put money behind shelf space, etc., will possibly be like 5 to 10% of that list. So if there are 300 books published by one publishing house, you are likely to be seeing or hearing about maybe 20 in the year at the most. You might hear of 2 books in the month that you want to buy from that publishing house, and you might even choose to buy it. But what happens to those 280 other books that are published in the year? Where do they go? What happens in terms of their presence on the bookshelves? Are there enough bookstores to keep that kind of book? Can you imagine every day there are that many books going into the bookstores? every day from multiple publishers. And yet you go into a bookstore and you will see Chetan Bhagat and Amish and 10 others that you've seen for years. There's no change in those, right? So there's something awfully wrong about this as far as I can see, that this is just not a healthy way for us to either choose what we want to read or be led to those choices that are actually dictated by somebody else. That experience of going out and finding a book, of browsing in a store, of saying, oh, I love this, whatever this book is supposed to look like, be what the blurb is saying about this book, or I've heard about this somewhere, I want to read this, that is happening less and less and less. And it's more and more about what you're being told to read. And because there's so much choice, you're being told to read one every day, right? And how much is their time? How much money are you going to spend? How many friends are you going to borrow from for how long? So you end up buying the obvious ones. And that, I think, is really what I wanted to talk about. Like, how is a bestseller made in India now? Maybe it's true of a lot of other countries as well. I don't think the patterns would be very different. But here, I think it is causing a problem, as it probably does anywhere else in the world, which is the invisibility that Urvashi spoke about some time ago, about how some books become invisible, how certain kinds of books, genres, writers, they exist, but they're not seen or heard about. Except perhaps, I think we're talking to a space where they may actually be heard about, because you look at books from a different perspective, because you actually engage with books as not just something to read for pleasure, but you're working in that space. Maybe you are led to a different selection. And perhaps that then keeps that list alive for a little longer than it might have otherwise. But the truth of this is also that English language publishing, Indian writing in English, has a very disproportionate visibility in India. If you look at if you look at the market, we talked about the lack of bookstores. You said maybe 100 bookstores are hard to come by. When we make a list of bookstores that we want our books to be in, at the most, with great difficulty, you might end up with a few hundred across the country. A lot of the bookstores that you go to might have a few books, and then they'll have stationery, or they'll have toys, or they'll have other things, right? There are very few stores that are actually curated in terms of their selection of books that they keep, that they know their customers, that they will, recommend books to customers, etc. That's very, very few. And unfortunately, Hyderabad, for instance, I think we've just not been able to get our books into enough stores in enough numbers for us to feel like we're having an impact in Hyderabad. We're not. Most of our selling happens in Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore. Bangalore is a really good place now for books. If you go to Church Street, where there's like a whole row of bookshops, those people are really invested in growing the business. They recommend books. They know their customers. They get people coming in. They work really closely with publishers and with their readers. And with COVID, there was a sudden explosion of, we have to do things differently because we're going to die otherwise, and Amazon is going to be the only thing that survives. So they started to supply books to even international customers. You could WhatsApp them and say, I want this book, this is my address, and they will send you an account number, you pay, and within 24 hours, the copy is dispatched. And they're willing to do this anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. This is a really radical change from bookstores that just sort of sat back and said, if somebody comes, they'll buy it, that's fine, that's enough. They realized that survival is not going to work that way, so they've completely changed their way of working. But this is limited to a few bookshops across the country, not like it's become the norm. So in that bestseller conversation, there are these little pockets where bookstores are creating bestsellers for their own little world. Like, say, Champaka. I don't know if you've heard of a bookstore called Champaka in Bangalore. They have a subscription model. So they will put together a box of books, and they will say, if you're subscribed to this, you will get a box. And you may not necessarily know what is in that box, or maybe they will inform you, but you will get a few books every so many months. And that is their store's recommendation of what you might want to read. So those things are gradually happening, but at the moment, what is happening mostly, apart from these other ways of doing things, is you go onto Amazon, you want to buy a book in a category, or you want to gift a book to someone, you look at it and you'll be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Obviously, these are the guys, and you'll read the reviews and you'll see how many stars and what they all say about the book, and then you just buy the book, right? And then you order it and you send it to someone, or you send it to yourself. And the moment you do that, immediately the algorithm says, oh, this is one more book added, another category to the bestseller list, and that goes on. I'll tell you the story of a publishing house that has completely changed this idea of what is a bestseller in the last few years, which is a publishing house called Wonder House. I don't know if you've heard about this. I know there was someone in the audience who works with children's books, so they might recognize it. Wonder House was part of a distribution center, a distribution company called Prakash Books, which is in Delhi. And Prakash is the single largest distributor now. They distribute all the large publishers' books across the country. Wonder House was an imprint they began for children's publishing. And in the last, 5-6 years maybe, this has become like 100 crore company or something. And what do? They sell children's books. They do basic books like your first alphabet book, your first mythology set. And during COVID in particular, when parents were busy trying to entertain their kids and were stuck at home and they had no reading, etc., these became the books that everybody just ordered because they were the cheapest. They would be really cheap and they would show up on Amazon all the time as number one in this category or that category. And so people started to buy them more and more. One knows that there was an enormous amount of marketing money spent on making this possible, because the algorithm means you have to really put money into driving that, making it visible, making it come up number one in all these categories. There are hashtags you have to work into the back end. You have to say children's literature, mythology, Indian, age group. You have to do all of these things so that when you search, those books show up first. And within these few years, this has become the largest, most profitable imprint in trade publishing at the moment. I mean, this is bigger than the kind of publishing that, say, a Penguin India does, right? Because it's just not possible to sell those numbers to an adult audience, but the children's market seems to have just absorbed it. So you had bestsellers coming up because publisher somewhere decided this is strategy, this is what is missing. And the interesting thing is, this is what every publisher has known for a long time, that everybody wants alphabet books, children's books are going to sell, ABCD is going to be like the big thing, everyone wants bedtime stories for kids. But it took someone to say, but what is going to make this more than a 3,000 copier or a 5,000 copier? And the difference obviously was marketing money. It was strategically where to park that marketing money. It was not enough to send out a large sales team to various stores to say, please stock more. They chose to invest in the online space. And that's where the difference was made. So somebody who was smart enough to use today's tools to make that happen managed to make something work, which has completely stymied most publishers. We all look at them with awe and shock, and we're like, what? How did that just happen? Like, most publishers, like a few crores is a lot of money to make in a year, because that's really a lot of books to publish with small number of people, resources, etc. So the business of publishing is really working with narrow margins. Royalties are tough, competition is tough, but then look at the space of out of copyright material. ABCD, no copyright, no authors, no author management. All you have to do is to put the books out, market them, sell them, and make money out of them. Simple, but it's worked. But then you come to the point of, what kind of books do you want to make for kids, right? Do you want to make innovative, beautiful, thoughtful books? Do you want to make kids think slightly differently? Do you want to do books that are about slightly more political, maybe in nature, addresses their needs here and now? Then you come up with, okay, so we can do this book, but we can only sell 2,000-3,000 copies. And then you don't have the way the economy of scale doesn't allow for it to become a success immediately. You have to sell them over years to make some money out of it. Most people can't afford to do that. So then you end up cramping the kind of publishing you do also, because it depends on the readers, the numbers, and you don't have those numbers. So it's like this constant cycling round and round. What comes first? Do you put in the money first and then hope that someday you'll make it back? Or do you wait to for evolved readers to say, yes, thousands of us want these books, and then publish to them? And so this waiting goes on and on. And that's why I think this conversation about a bestseller actually then keeps coming back to who makes a bestseller. And interestingly, I was just looking at how the bestseller has changed in my own time in publishing. When I started out in Penguin, This was, I think, a year or so before Arundhati Roy won the Booker Prize. And everybody, because the Booker made a huge difference, as it still does. I mean, it's the one prize in the world that means Indian readers go out and buy the book. It doesn't matter what it is. If it's won the Booker, they want it. They may never read it, but they will keep it. And that's an extraordinary thing. But we saw that happen with Arundhati's book. And when The God of Small Things became a success, every publisher thought that literary novel is the way to the bestseller charts and to making money. So everyone wanted to publish fiction. People were writing fiction about Kerala a lot. A lot of women were writing novels about relationships, and it became that sort of chase. And what happened was also that a lot of this depended on international agents. There was this whole myth making around Arundhati's agent, around how they made the huge success that the book was. So everyone in English language publishing here felt a certain dependence on that international agent, who would then send them the book that would become the big bestseller around the world, and you would be the publisher in India, so you would benefit. So for some time, that was what everyone sought. And then Mr. Chetan Bhagat arrived and said, what nonsense. Nobody wants to read your books that nobody even understands. And how many people read English like this? And what is this bestseller anyway? What are you talking about? Like 3,000, 5,000 copies? I can sell hundreds of thousands of copies of books. And every mainstream multinational publisher laughed and said, a PowerPoint does not make a bestseller, because Chetan came with a PowerPoint to show how marketing could transform and how his books would be and what he would do to market them. And I mean, this is obviously very funny now when we look back, but at that point, everyone was like, what do they know? Who are these people? They don't even know how to write English, because only a certain kind of English passed the gatekeepers in most publishing houses. And then Rupa published the books, and then we know what happened, because it's just like actually those hundreds of thousands of copies sold. And it was a shock to everyone's system. They didn't know what had happened and why this was happening. Subsequently, theories were trotted out. Research showed that, it was selling in smaller towns as well. People had taken to it because it was in English, and they felt that they wanted to read in English, and here was language and a story that worked for them. So anyway, all of that is pretty passé, I guess. Everyone knows all of this. But it was a big shift in the way publishers could see what a bestseller was. And suddenly 5,000 copies didn't cut it anymore as a bestseller. If it was 100,000 copies, then it was a bestseller. And Chetan built the machinery for it. He single-handedly, I think, showed Indian language publishing in English what could be, that their understanding was a bit like tunnel vision for mainstream fiction. And he went from place to place, he talked to readers, he engaged with readers, and this was before social media. This was before there was technology to aid that kind of communication. So a lot of it was simple things like go into a bookstore, shake hands with the shop floor guys, tell them who you are, so that next time somebody comes in and is looking for a book, they remember that this book exists, this writer exists, and they would put it in front of the customer. So they took, like your Eureka Forbes guy who went from place to place making sales happen. Suddenly the writer had transformed into a salesman as well. I mean, you wouldn't catch writers before that actually going out to bookstores and trying to sell books, right? But someone like a Chetan said, it's important. And these guys are the ones I'm going to sell through, not the people who are reviewing books. Book reviews did not matter for Chetan Bhagat. What mattered was readers. And that was, I think, a huge shift in the way marketing was done. It's also an interesting point that it was an independent Indian publisher who went that route, who took that chance, who published someone like that and then made a huge success of it. And that's the other pattern. Again, like you said, the independent publisher does the hard work, takes the risks, and then at some point, the bigger advances come in from the publishers who have the money, and they get taken away elsewhere. After Chetan, there was Amish, right? Amish did mythology. And I keep marveling at this, that at a time when this country was kind of moving into more alive conversations on mythology, Hinduism, the politics of representing Hindu characters and gods and the way they're written about, etc. Amish said, I want to write these books. And again, systematically, agents, publishers, nobody believed. Everyone was just like, what is this? It's just very badly written fiction. We all read about Vishnu and Shiva and all. Why do we need another book? And anyway, who's this banker guy who wants to write fiction? There's just so many levels at which that prejudice has been embedded in much of what we do. And it just becomes visible when you look back and you say, well, these were the reasons sometimes that you reject books, not because you thought that the story did not work in itself. You weren't willing to sit down and put the work into the story because you had no faith that this story mattered. What nobody realized was the story mattered to hundreds of thousands of readers. That Immortals of Meluha series just sold and sold and sold through a single bookstore in Delhi, Bari Sons, which started it up. The distributor, the bookseller said, I will publish it myself. He agented Amish, he published the book, and they made sure with their marketing that it reached bookstores across the country. And they piled them up, so if you walk into a bookstore and if you see this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that's one clear way in which you will go up and pick those books up. The other way for most readers is when you see a pile, right? You assume that if somebody in a bookstore has kept right in front some 30 copies of a book sitting right there, there's a reason for you to pick it up. And it must be something that everybody's reading and you want to be part of that conversation. You want to read what is successful also and what everyone's talking about, so you pick it up. They did that with Immortals of Meluha. It was everywhere, it was piled up. And people started to pick it up, word of mouth, everyone started to fall in love with it. And the bookseller said, no, I can't even deal with this because it's selling like 20,000 copies in a month, which was a hell of a lot in those days. Next thing you know, Westland and Amish have an agreement, and Westland has picked up the book and they're publishing it, and hundreds of thousands of copies are selling per book, not just like together of the series. And then he starts the Ramchandra series, and that goes on to sell lakhs as well. So that book, again, the story is about marketing, but it's also about catching a moment, I think, when there was a gap in the market, that kind of story hadn't really been done before. And the clones followed, of course. There were several successful clones immediately after that. Mythology became this wave of, reinventing. There was Asura, and then there was Duryodhan, and then there's Dushasan, and then there's Karna, and the stories just went on and on and on and on. And then it stopped because everybody got very tired and said, okay, so the person who had established this, he continues to sell, but most everybody else kind of dropped out of the map there. And mythology now is like, no publisher really wants to publish very much unless it's outstanding, substantial in some way, it's gone. But it established something that, again, if you get the right book and the right moment and you market it right, you are selling hundreds of thousands of copies, while on an average, we're still working with 2,000, 3,000 copies of a book as a first print run. So the difference is really huge. I mean, lakhs of copies at one level with 3 or 4 writers, and the rest will sell 3,000 copies. And there's very little in between. There's non-fiction that keeps filling that space with one book or the other, but not like a writer with a body of work. That's really hard to come by. So that happened, and then what I call the young ones happened into the bestseller list, which was, I'm sure you guys would have read writers like Ravinder Singh, Durjoy Datta, Preeti Shenoy. Have you read any of them? No? Nobody? Yes, you have. Right. Okay. Because those, okay, so when we were young, we had Mills and Boons. I don't know if you guys ever read whether it moved on to this generation, but we had Mills and Boons, and everybody read Mills and Boons, and all the lending libraries at Mills and Boons stacked up. And everyone in publishing again knew that romance works. Romance is the obvious thing that works, right? Whether it's The Bridges of Madison County, or whether it was The English Patient, or whether it was Love Story, there's always a love story that is selling at any point of time. But Indian publishers in English couldn't crack it. I mean, everyone tried to do Mills and Boon versions, which didn't work. Then various other occasional books would pop up. Then there was like an Anuja Chauhan would write a wonderful, really happy, well-written romance, and it would sell. But then these boys discovered romance, Ravinder and Durjoy and all of them. And suddenly it was like, I have a love story. I too have a love story. They don't have a love story. I have something to say. And they just sold. And again, we went back to hundreds of thousands of copies. And publishers are like, what just happened? Like, why are we saying this is great publishing? We don't know. But again, it was a small publishing house that did it. It was Srishti. I don't know if you've noticed this brand, Srishti, but Srishti started to do exactly what the Mills and Boon guys did. They just published numbers, large numbers. There would be, you could send in a book about, I remember reading something which was like this guy who's gone to study medicine in Russia, or, people just kept putting their autobiographical novels out there as young 20-year-olds, 18-year-olds, 30-year-olds, whatever, that age group, writing about romance. And some of it was like very tragic and things happened to them. But they were all very good-looking writers. I think this helped. They were very like photogenic, and they would just go and stand there. They were interested in what they wore. They wore glasses with plain lenses instead of not wearing glasses because they had to look geeky at shows. They did all of that right imaging to make themselves wanted. I have been to an event where, like in a bookstore where it was Ravinder and Durjoy, and there was this whole bunch of girls, and when they walked in, they went, ooh, I'm like, what is this? This does not happen to writers. It was happening to young writers, and they wanted to touch them, and they wanted to marry them, and they wanted to love them. They wanted to have sex with them. This was all like out there in this very lustful, you guys are just magic to us, and we've changed our lives, and we're all writing books, and we want you to read what we're writing, and it was just extraordinary, It was very different from the Chetan Amish wave. This was young people relating to young writers. And suddenly writing itself had become trendier in a way it wasn't earlier. So that wave lasted for a bit. And Durjoy and Preeti, when they write now, they still sell a lot of copies. Ravinder's is a different story, which if you're on Instagram, you will have noticed, or go find him, you'll know something else is going on there where he's trying to reinvent himself. But again, that wave has subsided. It's like, okay, bahut ho gaya. Now, like romance, theek hai. We are moving on to other stuff, or we're bored. And anyway, you can't have the same writers, right? What happens is a 20-year-old writer writes romance and is much wanted as a person, as a celebrity writer. And that poor man grows older. He's now 30, he might be 35, and the 20-year-olds are looking to somebody else for their, little sort of engagement of celebrityhood. So then that also went away. And in all of this, you'll realize that none of these books would probably have turned up on your reading lists in an academic space. None of these books would possibly be studied except in popular fiction courses. Because one of the things that did not happen through all of this is writing. I mean, the kind of writing that one normally values, one would go back and read the lines again by somebody who you think is writing a text that has multiple layers in it, or, you need to think about. None of that was happening here. This was out and out popular fiction. And that bestseller thing was, apart from the Booker Prize books, it became only that kind of writing, which has also been kind of difficult, because how do you go out and commission bad writers? Think about editors. They have to commission books, acquire books that will sell. If you have an Arundhati Roy as a model, you know what to do. You go, you find the best stories, you find the best writing, you find writing that really moves you, you do all of that. But here were people who were deliberately dumbing down the writing. They were saying, we are talking to non-readers. We want non-readers to read us. This was Chetan's big thing, that people may not read books, but they will read one Chetan Bhagat. That's what I want them to do. And if everyone reads one Chetan Bhagat, I am a bestseller. So converting non-readers to readers meant that they did succeed in that for a little bit. But what we had all hoped for at that time in publishing was that they would start, like it was like this ladder. They would start reading that one book that they never thought they would read, which may be a Chetan or an Amish or whoever writes in that popular fiction segment. And then they would get hooked to reading and to books. And the next thing you know, they would be reading like a slightly more complex book, and then they would be reading another one, and then they would get more sophisticated in their reading. And then we would reach this place where really good books would become bestsellers. It just didn't happen. The people who read that one Chetan Bhagat or two or three or Amish or Ravinder or whatever stopped there. They were hit by what might have happened is they got hit by the audiovisual world. It was like there was a time when we hoped that books would be the next step for them. They just switched completely, I think, to watching shows. They were cheap. They had them on their phones. They had Netflix, and then they had, well, not maybe Netflix for everyone, but they certainly had like Star and Sony and Z and Amazon Prime and all the rest of it. And suddenly, all the stories they were talking about, all the shows they were talking about, like, it had nothing to do with books. Books had just kind of vanished from interest at that level, and it was all about who's watching what. So occasionally there would be intersections. Like, you remember the movie called Razi with Alia Bhatt? Yeah. So that's a really good story for how publishing could and could not and does not work, which is, it was actually based on a book. I don't know if you know this, but there was a book called Being Sehmat, which was published and did nothing. Nobody had heard about it. But Razi was built and inspired by and more or less followed the trajectory of the story of Being Sehmat, which was based on a real life story. The moment Razi was out, Being Sehmat sold some 25,000 copies in that 1 month, you know. The book was the same. It wasn't a brilliantly written book or anything, but the story was there. And it flowed in one to the other. So now it's like another time when publishers are looking at the bestseller list and saying what is selling. They are selling books that have that tie. I mean, remember Slumdog Millionaire? Q&A was the book that it was based on. And Q&A got published in hardback as a literary novel. It was the first book that Random House published in India after setting up. And there was a lot of publicity for it in the literary space, which was limited. And then Slumdog Millionaire happened. And now you won't find Q&A in the market, I think. I think you'll find the paperback which calls itself Slumdog Millionaire. It's just like Q&A didn't need to exist now because the popular list has taken it over. So from that, there's this occasional bestseller that comes out of the screen. And now what is happening is, publishers included, everyone is looking for IP, which is content. The word content is becoming more and more the word that people are using, because you get a good story. It's a bit like the Disney world, right? You get a good story, it becomes maybe an animation. At some point, it'll become a big budget movie, like the Marvel universe, where you then keep inventing characters to feed into that. You have one formula that works, and then you build big bestsellers. So, of course, Harry Potter did that in a sense, right? It had huge success, and then it had a series, and then it became movies, and it became many other things. So now everyone is saying, okay, maybe it won't begin with the book, or maybe it'll begin with the book, but let's look at it 360 degrees. If there is a really successful show, can it become a novel? If there is a really good novel, can it become an adaptation of some sort? Is there a great podcast that is, really making people sit up and take notice? Can that podcast convert into a show, or can it convert into a collection of nonfiction? Or can it be the trigger for something else that's really interesting? So everyone's looking at this because a book as a sort of the central feature of reading, I think, has shifted position. I don't know if it's going to be like that forever, but certainly we are now thinking more and more about what else. What other format can something go in? If somebody sent in a really interesting book, is that a book, or is that also a book plus show? And then are you going to go pitch it to HBO today first, make a success of it? We have writers, like I have a writer who's written this really wonderful, fun, speculative fiction sort of thing, which goes from 10th century India to like a futuristic India. And he said, listen, I don't want any money for this. I don't want any great advance, but I want to sign the book because I want to be able to go back to Dharma and Yashraj and all of these guys and say, look, I have a contract. This book works. And these editors have said they really like it and they're going to publish it. So here is this book that we're going to do. And now you can see that it's worth turning into a series, a web series. So there are writers who are using the book to pitch for series. And the book is just one part of that process. It's not like the beginning and the end anymore. It's the beginning, or it's the in-between, or maybe sometimes it's just the end and the beginnings have been somewhere else. So it's a whole new world, I think, that we are beginning to inhabit. I mean, it's hardly mature. It's just ideas. And I don't know, maybe it'll not happen in fruition in exactly this way. But we don't think that we can get readers back to those 100,000 copy numbers with just a book anymore. Chetan Bhagat went to the next level because also Three Idiots happened, because the movies happened with Alia and whoever else. And suddenly it wasn't just one thing. It was, the people who went to watch Three Idiots also went back and read the book. So the idea of the bestseller, I think, has changed so much now that we're all trying to see. We can't invent them sitting in publishing houses. We try, but I think the unexpected ones, the sudden spurts of popularity, possibly are not just going to come because somebody wrote a book. It's probably going to come because somebody had a great story, and then that story became many things. And you, as a reader, is now, you're suddenly like this content consumer, and you may reach that content at various points in its development, and your choice is going to be any of these things. And we, as people who are working within the space, may have to target this person for the book and that person for the show and this other person who's really just listening to audiobooks and does not have time to read or is not interested. We have to really dissect and divide the market perhaps in order to create it and make it bigger. So it's a very different thinking that's going on, I think, in a lot of publishing minds now, where people are trying to second guess what everyone's going to want next and then create and plan for that to happen. So it's a bit iffy. I think that this is very nascent at the moment, but it's very, very interesting and very challenging to think that you can get like a whole country to do what you might do with a show. Like when Brahmastra comes out and the whole country and many others outside this country are talking about it. We've never been able to get a book to do that kind of thing, right? But maybe if you went from the product of that show to the book, maybe you will have everyone sitting up and saying, I can't wait to read this book. So we're all in that phase of discovery. We're trying to hope and see whether this bestseller, the idea of the bestseller, can move in different directions. And any publisher that gets to be that that person who creates that is obviously going to be very lucky. But there's one thing I missed out in this bestseller evolution, which is the biggest bestsellers now, and have been for some time, are in that self-help space. Again, I don't know if you've read a book called Ikigai. Have you read Ikigai? Yes. So Ikigai, again, something that came in from the West, but just has swept the Indian bookstores as well, and sequels to it, and all kinds of things are happening with that. But that self-help space in India, which was always about, how to live better, 7 atomic habits or whatever it is, or successful ways to think, or the psychology of money, all of these things have been bestsellers for a long time, and they continue to be. But what we added in India somewhere in the last few years has been the gurus. A book by Jaggi will sell hundreds of thousands of copies. When he writes a book on death or karma or whatever, Swami Mukundananda or Gaur Gopal Das, or all of these people who are in that spirituality self-help space, the biggest bestsellers at the moment. I mean, the numbers are mind-boggling and people are just lapping them up. And the thing with these guys is they are keen on marketing, right? So again, it comes down to the fact that they have entire organizations marketing them. So when a book is released by one of these people, the entire followers sect, right? That whole group, and they have very large online lives now, right? They have like websites, but they have WhatsApp communities, and they will announce to their followers that this book is out, and then all the followers will go out and buy the book. So that first burst of buying that happens of thousands of copies is not just people who are interested in the book or the idea. They're actually hardcore followers of that guru. But it means that people are going into bookstores, they're asking for the book. So the bookseller's like, wow, this book's a bestseller. They're going to put them up in front again, and they're going to keep selling because now everybody knows that they're bestsellers. So these gurus now, every publisher who's not a committed publisher in a very different way from yours, but is mostly into like also how to just focus commercially on what is profitable, they are seeking out gurus like nobody's business. It's like, oh, who's this guy on Instagram? He has this thing and it's video, and he had a TED talk and he talks really well. So how many followers does he have? How many on Insta? How many on YouTube? Right. He has 1 million followers. He has to write a book. And the substance of these books is, it's just like whatever, habits and how to be good or how not to be whatever. It's got nothing in there. It's got nothing that none of us don't know. But because of these systems that exist around them and the organizations, they have become among the biggest bestsellers of our time. And finally, along those same lines, the newest lot of celebrity writers that we have, and celebrity memoirs, celebrity self-help books have become the biggest thing. They are the people who have like social media presence. So if you have whatever, a few million people following you on Insta, and what you're doing is telling people makeup, body, health, medicine, health and medical care has become like a huge thing, especially perhaps post-COVID. So there are doctors on these platforms who give yarn on and write really well. You know, they'd be like, so there's this guy called Liver Doc, handle Liver Doc, yeah. So he will say Ayurveda is all bunkum, homeopathy is ridiculous, and you know, you're all killing people. The other day there was someone else who's a good friend who wrote something about cough syrup and said cough syrups are just they're useless. They will do nothing for you. Don't have cough syrups, you know. And then there were all these people, no, you can't say that, you can't say this. And then a big discussion revolves around that. And the next thing you know, a publisher is calling them frantically and saying, write a book for us. And the next thing you know, it's selling 100,000 copies, right? So it's going from short tweets to now we want this person to write a book, because that's a ready-made bestseller. What do you need for a bestseller? You need an audience. You have an audience that's already primed to like this guy, has already engaged with them, has written to them, almost like felt like, you know, they're talking to them by writing them on Twitter. They're already a committed audience. And you can almost measure your print runs by that and say, okay, so many followers, so much engagement, so many copies of the book will sell. So writing has become a whole different thing, because a lot of these guys are also ghost written. They're not ghosted, they're ghost written. So they will pay someone will write up the material for them, their name is what will sell it. So what you will then maybe someday end up studying in a course of writing will be not written by them at all. It will be written by somebody else. But it's about all these other things that have made them a writer. So a bestseller is not necessarily a writer, but they are authors. And once that authorship has been established, they will remain the people who control that, you know, conversation about they wrote it and they did it. Sometimes the ghostwriter is not acknowledged, sometimes they are. So from health to financial literacy, this is the other big thing now. Everybody wants to be financially literate, which is a great thing, but they want 10-year-olds to be financially literate. The biggest growing market now in India for conversation, for potential books, etc., is how to get kids to be financially literate. How do you get kids to know how to invest in stocks and shares and where to park their money and how to save money and what does money mean to kids, etc. This is completely shocking to someone like me who's like at 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old. What money do they have? What money are they trying to invest? But apparently it doesn't matter, because middle class India is now giving their kids money for gifts. There's money to be pocket money or whatever they have, but even the schools are doing shows and talks on financial literacy. So it is something that is now seen as a good space. And there are very well-known financial consultants who are doing courses online and workshops online, which are massive attendance of kids of that age. And you know, these apps, I'm not very good with this financial literacy apps, but there are some where, and you also have very easy access to investing. So you might have 100 rupees, you can invest it somewhere. And the app makes it very easy for you to do so. So this is happening. So basically what is happening, I think, to publishers is our earlier quest for the great novel or the great piece of literature has dissolved into how many followers, how much Insta presence, do they talk well, do they look well, do they manage to have like this charismatic presence? Because how do books sell? Not necessarily to readers, but to, like, if this was a selling space for a publisher, it would be that you all registered for a talk, and the cover charge of being part of this talk is you have bought a copy of the book, and there's a writer here and this writer is going to talk to you. So whatever, 100 copies of the book have sold, the publisher's given them on some discount, and you multiply this and you try and set up a number of talks for your writers across where the book is being sold, and then you make the book a bestseller. Again, these people have registered for a DIY talk. They want to be educated in something, right? So that kind of book. But you get a literary writer and you try and register 100 people to come and listen to them, nobody will want to pay. So there's no money to be had from, everyone's tried, like we've tried ticketing events where there are writers, you will get them for celebrities and you will get them for these kinds of things, but you won't get them for a really fine writer who has things to say that might change the way you think. Not important. So all of this is happening at the same time in this slightly crazy, unplanned, ad hoc sort of way, and it's becoming a bit trial and miss and error and whatever those old ways of trying something and hoping they'll work. But that's really what mainstream publishing in trade has become. And just so you know, trade publishing in India, which is like what all of us do, is like 5% of the big publishing scene. 5%, I think. 95% is school textbooks, academic publishing, all the books that come on to people's lists in school and so on, or you might buy for your child, not in the bookstore, but through, say, a school recommendation. A lot of books fit into that learning category. But 5%, which is why I said it's kind of disproportionate that 5% of the market is the one that you see when you go into a bookstore, that you want to learn about, that you pick up, that you talk about. But that's really how it is. And in this process, what is happening is books like, say, Zubans, or books like even a lot of books everybody else publishes, unless they fit that category of wanted big time by readers in that way, they just don't show up. I mean, that's where we become very grateful for Amazon and online selling, because at least those books are there for you to find if you want to look for them. Whereas if you look at bookstores and the kind of space they have and literally the inches they have for books, there's only that much they can display, right? So the books that have come in for a while as new will quickly move to the back and then will quickly vanish back into the distributor or the bookseller's warehouses. They're not visible. But you can still go to Amazon if you're a reader who wants to discover stuff and browse and search and say, okay, I'm going to actually look at what's there, read the reviews, and maybe decide for myself. At least that possibility exists now, minus the bookstores in the physical brick and mortar space, as they say. So I think what I've laid out is pretty much the ecosystem as it stands now. You'll see now why I wanted Urvashi to come first, because this is really about what's in flux at the moment, and it would make no sense unless Urvashi had given you the history of how we got to this point. And I don't know where we are headed, but I'm not sure we are headed to a great place in terms of publishing. I think we are looking at a place where it's going to be really hard to do innovative, interesting, meaningful work. I'm very glad that I have done many years at a time when it felt it was possible to do that. From here on, I really think it's going to be a struggle. And there's going to be a lot of like this celebrity stuff and, stories that will not make much of a difference except for that momentary, interest. And I'm just hoping that there will continue to be some support. Look, we don't have translation grants. We don't have funding. We don't have an arts council like some countries do, which will recognize great writing and which will pull it out and, which will make a big deal out of it. The prizes that India has, they make no difference to sales. Books win prizes, everyone's very happy, publicity happens, but when you look at the sales at the end of the month or the end of the year, very little difference. So nothing else is there. The only thing one can hope for is that readers themselves will somehow find their way to bookstores and find the books that we want them to read. Because any way of getting readers to recognize the best kind of writing is getting harder and harder and harder. And whatever we do, the commerce and the reality of publishing means that it's very hard to find the money to push the right books. You end up pushing the easy books. And okay, look at it from the sales guy's point of view. He has to make a budget every month. I mean, if you're a salesperson, you have to sell so much to make your budget. Then instead of selling 50 books to 50 places, you sell one book, which has a potential, according to them, to sell 500 copies. You just focus on that one book, right? You make your budget. So everybody is out there pushing the easy thing to sell, and nobody is actually working really hard to put the meaningful into visible spaces. So it's a difficult time, and I don't think it's going to get any better. On which note, I should stop talking. I think it should be past time. So maybe if there are questions, we can always talk. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. When you mentioned that mainstream publishers depend on influencers, for sales. I was also wondering whether the dependence would be mutual, because when an influencer, I mean, I noticed that mostly when influencers get called out, it's when they have to respond to a contemporary issue, when they do not have time to research. Because partly because we expect influencers to be knowledgeable about everything, and then when they are asked to respond on an instant platform like the news or Twitter, then they make blunders. But when there's a publisher for them, they have the luxury of either asking a ghostwriter or doing some research, I suppose, before they can voice an opinion. I ask this because in Kerala I've noticed that several influencers, especially those with religious backgrounds, are starting their own publishing mechanisms, so that they do not have to bother with conflicting interest from another publisher. And these publishing mechanisms have like amazing, as in they are managing to sell a lot. Any devotee of this influencer will buy whatever comes out of her or his press. So I was wondering if the dependence was mutual and what you felt about it.
I think the dependence is mutual, that's true. But when you were saying that they're all looking to publish their own stuff, for instance, and that was the way it used to be. But now what they want is they want to be visible on a pan-India platform in places where they may not be otherwise, where they not normally get access or entry. So they want to be mainstream outside of their own. And trust me on this, the guru space, for instance, is filled with massive competition. Each guru's followers, they have like people who are trained data analysts and so on, who are constantly watching to see how did that person become a bestseller? How many copies have to sell to become a bestseller? So then we will also do the same thing. We will also get our team to buy so many copies in a day so that our book becomes a bestseller. It's quite surprising actually when you think about it, that the whole spiritual space is now so commercial that they just want to occupy every space possible. It's not enough for them to be within their world and to make the most of it. So they depend on the publisher depends on the influencer back again, and it's become this really cozy, comfortable thing where you're not questioning what you're putting out in the market. What are these? I mean, some of the stuff is so regressive. Some of the things that they say is completely unscientific. But everyone's just saying, okay, if it sells 100,000 copies, I'm just going to shut my eyes to this, right? I'm going to say, whatever, people want it, so I'm putting it out. So that aspect of responsibility that I think was there at some time and still there in parts in publishing, of feeling that you are actually doing something to create, to amplify, to the body of knowledge that you were looking at earlier when she was talking about it. I think there's a complete diminishing of that, and people who are coming into the publishing industry now and working within it are mostly people who want to make profits. And since profits is the main thing, all of these things will happen alongside.
Hello, ma'am. So instead of relying on bookstores for curation, how about if we work more on websites for curation? For example, Movie is doing with movies, so it's a curated service streaming platform. How about doing that work with books?
It's something Goodreads tried it, remember?
Yeah.
And so for some time everyone thought Goodreads is going to make a huge difference even in India, and we realized it's making zero difference. There just aren't enough people who are using Goodreads or feeling that that's where they can find their next read. So gradually reviews have started to come down, engagement has started to come down, and that's what. Book TikTok has made a huge difference in the US and other parts of the world. Literally, if somebody on Book TikTok is talking about a book really interestingly and someone who has a large following, copies were selling in tens of thousands after that. Bestsellers were being made on it. India has gone back to TikTok, so Book TikTok. So we just keep hoping that this next mechanism will work. Like I was saying, Urvashi also, there's someone who's just started a website for books and Indian publishing, someone out of Delhi, and he's hoping to do something like this, which is to have content, writers, reviewers, people talking about what's important, what's selling, all of those conversations, and he's hoping that his website will drive people to discover. But we don't know, it's very, very new, and I think it's the first one to stand.
Will the written word even survive in iconic word?
I don't see how it can't. I don't think there's any other. I honestly think there's no replacement for the written word. And maybe one may read it on a different form. Maybe I read it on my phone or on my screen rather than on a physical book. Maybe that's going to happen, but I don't see how the word can't survive.
This question is for both of you, but more to do with what you were speaking. We've been talking about alternate forms of publishing, which are no longer alternate, but they are very much part of mainstream marketing and the circulation of literature itself. But what about those genres that we consider, very integral to literature, or those that have traditionally always been part of literature, like your poetry, which is always considered something that's traditional canonical literature. You have the biography, etc. So, how has the emergence of technology as a forerunner in the circulation of literature, how has that played a part in the form of this being changed? Like Amish Tripathi, you were mentioning, when his book started coming out, there were book trailers for the first time we saw trailers on Amazon about books. Bluff, which was a small publishing house, is suddenly in the limelight because you're bringing back Origin Sense River of Stories in a colored version. Science fiction is not a very big genre in the Indian publishing scene. Yes, there is Manjula Padmanabhan who is publishing with the big short story dystopia, etc. But Kurali Manikavel has suddenly come to the forefront because of Bluff again. There are biographies and autobiographies which are plenty today, but Zuban also I'm not sure of the dynamic there, but you have a couple of biographies in collaboration with the Google culture, art and space scene, like Rukma by Raut and all those guys are up there, and Zuban presents their biographies over there, and not in the traditional textual form, but as an exhibition is what we call it. So, what happens to all of these very time-tested and loved genres like poetry or Jerry Pinto, for instance, right now is doing an everyday update on his Instagram about how you can become a writer, and it's very different from, say, Ravinder Singh holding up a placard on his Instagram, talking about it or whatever he's doing. So, how have these genres, which you all also hear, how have these been changed? How are they changing because of these social media platforms or technology itself that targets people on a larger scale? And not just, you pick up, you look at the Paris Review and look at which writers are featured there, or you look at the Bombay Literary Review. It seems to be, the Bombay Literary Magazine seems to be a popular mode right now to look at which writers are coming out. So, what happens to these, genres that we all have always loved reading, like with the biography or science fiction?
I think that the biography, for instance, has become much bigger in terms of stability in the last few years. The subjects are different. They could be writers, or they could be celebrities, or they could be actors or sports. Something like a section autobiography is probably one of the largest selling books in that segment. So biographies, I think, are steadily marching on and doing very well. And there's a lot of really good, ambitious writing in that space. It will be taking a few years to work on a subject, spend a lot of time in the archives. There's a lot of really good writing. Popular history is the other one. There's a lot of writing in that which is becoming very popular now. Manu Pillai and Ira Mukherjee and Anirudh Kansetti. They're all writing for a new market very elegantly and telling stories from the past that are really touching people's that chord of I want to read more. And so they're constantly doing a lot more books in that category. Poetry is a tough one. Poetry, I feel, is the one that technology has damaged the most. Like, everybody is putting up poetry, everybody is writing poetry, and it's not really great poetry, but there's a lot of it happening. But what has happened in that is that the poetry that is now getting published and selling well, the Rupi Kaur sort of poetry, is coming out of that space, which is a very visual space, right? Illustrations, doodles, the story for the day, the shock value, All those things drove her popularity. And then it transferred popularity on the page with actual books becoming huge bestsellers. But while everybody says, oh, I read poetry, yesterday I was watching something on Instagram, a little reel, where this guy made the point that, I think he was talking to you about it, Rishi, about how poetry, when you are young, everybody seems to write poetry, but then you kind of forget about it. It's not like you want to think about poetry in your daily life. Most people don't. And then he said, when somebody dies or something really difficult happens in your life, for which you don't have the words or you don't know how to quite process it, he said an amazing number of people turn to that poem. I don't know if you noticed this, but when 2014 happened and the BJP came to power, possibly the most shared poem on the net was Yeats' Second Coming, slouching towards that 11 to be reborn. And everybody just kept saying, this poem just resonates with me, speaks to me. They didn't have the words to say or feel how they felt, but they knew a poem said it for them. So this person was just talking about how art, when it becomes life-sustaining, takes on a completely different form from when it was a beautiful thing or a pleasurable thing at a certain other stage in your life. I think that poetry on the net has just become a very different thing from poetry as published poetry, or in a different way, where a serious poet committed to reworking that word or that line for many attempts before they say, okay, this is good enough to publish. It's not that time anymore. It's like, toss it out, popular, how many likes you get. So it's almost like there are two ways to read and engage with poetry now. Thankfully, publishers continue to publish poetry as well, and I don't think that's going to go anywhere. I think Jerry's novels are always going to be published. I think the really good novel, the literary work, in whatever format, is not going to die. There's going to be publishers doing it. It's just that there will be a disproportionate attention to selling it, and therefore it may never really become what it could have become had the forces not been against it.
Yeah, no, I don't have that much to add to what Karthika is saying. She's right when she says biography is really developing into a very interesting genre, and lots of people are writing and reading. Of course, if you look at who those biographies are about, it is the same old, same old. It's really the elite, mostly male subjects, and it's seldom that you go beyond that, or it's seldom that a Dalit biography or autobiography will enter the best-selling space or even enter the mainstream space. Although that has been known to happen with one or two books, Valmiki's book, maybe Dayapavar's book, some of them have come into that, but there again, you will see it's mostly Dalit men. For example, Bama's autobiographical novel, Karku, which is been 30 years since it's been published, I would still not call it a bestseller. It hasn't sort of gotten into that space, but it has a staying power and a resilience, and it gets used in courses and so on. So I think it's what Karthika has been pointing out. The picture is so completely varied, and you can't speak about it in one breath as if the same thing holds true for everything. One thing I did want to add to what you were generally saying, the point you were making, about what doesn't make a bestseller, and therefore what enters the market, and therefore what gets considered as Indian writing in English, is also this whole business of pricing. There is a huge resistance to book prices going up, and if you look at the proportion in which prices of everyday products have gone up, and you look at book prices, you would be shocked at how little. I mean, if you raise the price of a book by 50 rupees, there is a huge resistance in the market. And for book publishers in the last, let's say, 10, 15, 20 years, everything, but everything has doubled in price. Paper prices have gone up almost 100%, printing inks have gone up, there's a huge shortage of paper in the market, binding has become more expensive, and then we have been hit with GST. So what happens is there is no GST on books, and this is something we fought for because we felt people would not pay that 18% extra. But what we did not realize was that we would have to pay that 18% extra on every product we bought. So there's GST on printing, GST on paper, GST on this, GST on that. The artist who does your cover will charge you 18% GST, but you can't put it on the price of the book. So what happens is that this huge resistance makes it very difficult to sell those books that are published in small numbers because they will have to be expensive. Whereas those books that are published in huge numbers can actually be priced quite low. So that also contributes to this whole business. I mean, I'm sure most of you will think nothing of buying a hamburger for 350 rupees, and the pleasures of that will disappear, if not in a few hours, within 24 hours. It will be in and out of your system. A book will stay for a very long time, but if it's 500 rupees, you will protest. And you're not the only one who will read it, others will also read it. But that's a huge resistance, which makes it very difficult.
Yeah, like with the GST, what you were saying, not only do we have to pay all the people who feed into the making of a book, but we don't get the reverse charge to the government. Like if you spend and you have a product where you're paying GST, then you can claim it as a reverse charge from the government. But because books are excluded from GST, we don't even get that. So we just keep giving and giving, and there's no return of any sort. So now the battle is trying to see books can actually be included perhaps in GST to get the benefit of it rather than leave out. So there's all of these things, and the pricing is a huge factor. There's no way we can't take up book prices. But it's like, okay, 500 was one thing, you can't go above 500. Then we went up to like 799, and people don't seem to be resisting that much. Now it's like a 999 thing. That 1,000 rupee threshold, I think, is like I don't know how many years it will take to break out of that. Nobody wants to pay that much. But you look at a regular book, which is like a deeply researched book that an author has spent like 2-3 years writing or working on, and you have a handsome looking book that's coming to you, it's like 700 pages. You don't want to pay like over 1,000 rupees for that. It doesn't make sense, right? You should be wanting to, be willing to pay that kind of money for that. But nobody does, so nobody dares break that amount. And therefore, there'll always be reason to say either we can't publish it or please edit, please bring it down to a sizable length, so then you lose a lot of good ideas that can't even happen.
So we'll reserve the rest of the questions for the panel. We will now thank you so much, Karthika, and thank you, Roshi.